Berlin, as night descends slowly over the city, lights begin to blink on, one window at a time. The sky hangs heavy in shades of iron and mist, and the stars are tucked behind a pale, smoky veil. The city seems not to breathe, yet everything carries a weight, an echo of more than meets the eye. Leaves drift quietly across the old stones of the sidewalks, stirred by a cold wind that snakes its way through the alleyways like a messenger from another time. It is not an icy wind, but it brings with it a sense of waiting, and perhaps a quiet unraveling. Everyone who lives here carries a weight in their chest, not just from the past, but from the uncertainty of what lies ahead. Street lamps throw long shadows across the pavement. The city remembers every step ever taken here. And among these streets walks a woman. Her name is Anna. She lives in East Berlin, just a few blocks from the wall. In a small apartment filled with quiet furniture and faded upholstery, her life unfolds with precise simplicity, everything in its place, everything restrained. Tonight something feels different. Something is in the air, not seen, not heard, but felt. Like the first turning of a season before the leaves fall. She doesn't understand it with her mind, but her body knows. Her memory knows. This isn't where her story begins. Her story began much earlier, on another autumn morning many years ago, the day the wall rose. She was a child then, holding tightly to her mother's hand, watching the growing lines of concrete and barbed wire from the window. She didn't yet understand the tension in her mother's shoulders, didn't know that something invisible had been broken. As she grew, the wall became part of her life's architecture, not just a structure, but a division etched into her thoughts, a boundary between childhood and adulthood, between dreaming and waking, between possibility and reality. She walked past it on the way to school, always present, always watching, not shouting, not threatening, just there. And in its silence, it whispered a message to all who passed. In time, she became a young woman. She studied nursing. She worked in a hospital. Her life, like the city, was quiet and gray. There were no sudden movements, no unguarded thoughts. People did not speak their minds, not in shops, not on buses, not at work. Thinking was permitted, but speaking could cost you. At the hospital she found moments of peace. Sick people had nothing left to hide, their faces, their words, stripped of pretense. It was there she first learned how to read what went unspoken. In the early mornings, she queued for bread. Some days there was butter, other days not. They drank roasted barley instead of coffee. Life was steady, but colorless. State newspapers repeated the same slogans, the same smiling leaders, the same statistics and promises. No one believed them, but they read them anyway, or at least they turned the pages. Music from the West arrived like fog, faint and forbidden. Some carried cassette tapes in their coat linings. A song, if you were lucky enough to hear it, could feel like a window opening somewhere far away. In her room, Anna had a cracked cassette player, plastic with one broken button. Late at night, she listened with the volume low, sometimes closing her eyes, pretending she lived in that music, in that place beyond the wall. A place that might never exist for her, and yet always did, in her mind. At night, The city held its breath. Only the wind moved, gliding between tram tracks and concrete walls. The wall itself glowed faintly under the moonlight, like a line drawn across memory. Time felt slower here, even still. And people, they adapted. The younger generations never knew any different. West Berlin was a map reference, an abstract idea, a forbidden color in a grayscale world. Each face wore the same kind of exhaustion, not quite hopeless, not quite hopeful, just used to things. May Day parades, Soviet anthems, concerts arranged by unions. The rhythm of life was unchanged, predictable, limited, contained. But deep within her, Anna carried something quiet, not a thought, not a dream, a soundless, shapeless longing, like the echo of a song never sung. It had no language, only a weight. Then came the mid-1980s.
Something in East Berlin began to shift, not in the buildings, not in the streets, but in the way people moved, in the way they spoke, or didn't. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt as thick. It had begun to crack at the edges. In Leipzig, people started gathering in church courtyards, not for protest, not quite, just to be together, to stand side by side in the open, to wait. The Monday marches began, at first just a few dozen, then hundreds, then thousands. No banners, no slogans, only presence. Word of these gatherings reached Anna. Whispers at work, brief mentions on carefully tuned radio stations, and on the walls at night, messages drawn in chalk, washed away by morning, but never completely erased. It was as if the city was trying to remember how to speak. Anna listened, watched. She never marched, but in her silence, something stirred. Not hope, not yet, but its shadow. At the hospital, her colleagues spoke a little more freely. Not loudly, but the caution had begun to loosen. They asked questions, shared rumors. The West was watching. Something was changing. Across the border, she heard about Poland, about Hungary, about reforms. The tension tightened and loosened again, a breathing city waiting for something it could not name. Posters on the streets hadn't changed. The faces of leaders remained. But something behind the eyes of passers-by had. Their gazes lingered longer. They looked up, not down. In the grocery store one day, Anna noticed fewer goods than usual. The shelves had always been sparse, but now they were nearly bare. Even the illusion of normalcy was slipping. At tram stops, young people waited with backpacks and distant eyes. Some wanted to leave. Some had already tried. Some simply stood still, suspended between memory and possibility. That autumn, the leaves fell just the same. The colors were still gold, still brown, but the city was not the same. From her window, Anna saw someone leave a chalk message on a wall one night. By dawn, it was gone, but the outline remained, faint, like the trace of a dream. And in that smudge of white dust, she saw something beautiful. The city was remembering its voice. November 9th arrived like any other day. The city did not shake. There were no sirens, no sudden light. The sky over East Berlin was low and pale. A ceiling of soft gray stretched over rooftops and rails. The sun, if it was there at all, remained hidden behind the veil.
Yet there was something unspoken in the way the streets held their silence. Anna woke before the alarm. She often did now. Not from unrest, but from a habit carved by years of early mornings in steady repetition. The kettle hissed on the stove. The window held a faint breath of frost at its corners. Another ordinary day. She dressed, as she always did, in layers, practical and plain. She wrapped her scarf, tied her shoes, and stepped into a city that had not yet stretched its limbs. The tram arrived with its usual whine. Passengers entered without words. A nod here, a glance there. But no one smiled. At the hospital, the rhythm of duty resumed. Rounds, bed checks, paperwork. Children coughing in one wing, an old man sleeping in another. Anna moved like water through each corridor, steady and invisible. Yet throughout the day, strange ripples began to move across the surface. Whispers carried on lips barely parted. Something had been announced. On the radio. A policy change. Something about travel. No one seemed certain. Some repeated it with cautious hope. Others shook their heads, brushing it off like static. Another rumor, another misunderstanding. After all, hadn't they heard things like this before? But this time, there was no correction, no retraction. By mid-afternoon, the energy had changed. Like air before a storm, charged but still. People's movements were more hurried. Coats were thrown on quickly. Televisions remained on in common rooms. One report said citizens could now apply for exit. Another claimed they could simply go. But where? When? Anna left work early. She walked instead of taking the tram. Her feet needed the pavement, that cold certainty beneath them. She passed familiar shops with unfamiliar expressions behind the windows. A grocer stood frozen, holding a head of lettuce. A woman carried a radio pressed against her ear. Children ran through leaves in the park, oblivious. Somewhere a church bell rang without meaning. But meaning clung to everything. As she reached her apartment, she paused at the door. Then, for reasons she couldn't explain, she kept walking. Her legs followed the rhythm of something older than thought. Toward the wall. Toward the boundary that had shaped her entire life. She was not alone. Others were drifting too, individuals at first, then pairs, then clusters. Nobody spoke, but they moved with a shared knowing, as if summoned. Bornhorner Strasse. A checkpoint. Usually quiet, controlled, rigid. But now, there was a crowd. Small at first, growing with every minute. Faces illuminated not by joy, not yet, but by a cautious urgency. Eyes searching for permission, for confirmation. The guards stood behind the barrier. Stone-faced, still. But they did not push people back. They did not shout. They looked just as lost. Anna stood near the rear of the gathering, not pushing forward, just observing. The noise was rising now. Not a roar, but a building murmur of disbelief and waiting. Somewhere near the front, someone was speaking. An official? A citizen? She couldn't tell. Then, something happened. A gate, a movement, a single bar lifted, and then another. People hesitated. And then one stepped forward, then another, and the wall, that
endless barrier of her childhood did not stop them. Anna did not cry, did not smile. She simply stood there as the boundary that had defined her breath loosened its grip. Behind her, someone gasped, not from fear, but from something even deeper. Release. More people crossed. Cautiously, tenderly, as though waking into a dream. Anna remained on the eastern side, her hands in her pockets, her heart still. She didn't need to cross, not yet. The crossing had already happened inside her. For the first time, the wall did not seem like a wall. It looked tired, like an old monument, stripped of meaning. And the city, that cold, sleeping city, was just taking its first breath.
The night walk. The air grew colder as night fully descended, yet the city felt warm in a way Anna had never known. Not warm like fire or sun, but like a long-withheld breath finally exhaled. She had stood near the checkpoint for hours, watching, listening, feeling. More and more people arrived, some in silence, some in tears, some clapping, others simply blinking at the flood of light pouring through a once-closed gate. And then, without planning to, without deciding, Anna began to walk. Not fast, not fearful, just forward. The crowd around her was gentle, unhurried, reverent, as if everyone had instinctively understood the sacredness of this night. No songs, no speeches, only footsteps. She passed the guards, now standing off to the side, expressions unreadable. No one stopped her. No one asked for papers. The rules had dissolved like mist, leaving behind only people, human beings, breathing together. And then, suddenly, she was there. On the other side, West Berlin. It looked almost the same. Sidewalks, neon signs, shops, cars passing slowly, their headlights glowing like stars too close to the ground. But it felt different. Not louder, not yet. Just looser, lighter. Children stood at the edge of the crowd handing out bananas and chocolate. Strangers embraced without words. People stared at payphones, at shop windows, at vending machines, as if every small thing was a miracle. Anna walked further, not far, just enough to feel the world open. The cold air smelled different here, softer somehow. Or maybe it was just her imagination, which had waited so long for this. At a nearby plaza, a man knelt to the ground and touched the pavement with his bare hands. Another woman held a shopping bag in both arms as if it were an infant. Some stood still, as if unsure whether they were dreaming. Anna found a bench. She sat. She listened. The sound of laughter, not forced, not rehearsed, but free. People passed with cameras, some tourists, some locals who had never imagined they'd see this day. But Anna wasn't interested in souvenirs. She was more interested in the feeling that had settled inside her. A quietness, a release. Not joy exactly, not sadness either. Something in between. A stillness that only comes when the waiting ends. She sat for a long while. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't move much.
She simply watched. The river of faces, the flicker of camera flashes, the children waving East German flags like paper toys. And then, after enough time had passed, she stood. No urgency, no regret. She turned around and began to walk back, towards the gate, towards the side of the city where her life still waited. No one stopped her return. There were no barriers now, only people moving in both directions, like breath, in and out. She passed a teenager crying softly, not from fear, not from joy, just overwhelmed. She understood. Back in East Berlin, the streets were still awake. Not loud, not chaotic, but humming with something ancient and new. People leaned from windows. Others stood on rooftops watching the horizon, as if waiting for the sun to rise a little earlier than usual. Anna reached her building, climbed the stairs, entered her apartment. It looked the same. It smelled the same. But it no longer felt the same. She turned off the lamp, sat by the window, looked out over the city she had always known. It had not moved, but it had changed. And somewhere, deep inside her, a door she had forgotten ever existed was now open. Not wide, just enough to let in the air.
The morning after. Morning returned, as it always did. No fireworks, no sirens, only soft light brushing across the walls of the apartment, gently pressing through the curtains like fingers of mist. Anna opened her eyes slowly, not from a dream, but from something heavier, the kind of sleep that follows deep release. For a moment, she forgot, and then remembered. She sat up. The room looked no different. The faded rug, the books on the shelf, the quiet hum of the radiator, all still in place, yet everything felt untethered, as though the entire world had taken one step to the left while she was sleeping. She moved to the window. The street below was quieter than usual. Not empty, but subdued, like a stage after the curtain has fallen, when the cast lingers behind the velvet, uncertain whether the applause was real. People walked slowly, heads turned upward instead of down. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk without being told to hush. A man leaned against a lamppost, smiling into the sunlight, not at anyone, just at the day. Anna made tea. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need to. The news lived in the air now. You could taste it, feel it in the way spoons touched porcelain, in the stillness of pigeons on the rooftop. She dressed without urgency, wrapped her scarf, though the morning was unusually mild. Outside, she walked, past the bakery with the always empty shelves, past the post office with the fading posters, past the playground where two swings moved in the wind. No announcements had been made, no sirens rang out, but the truth was everywhere. The wall, as it had existed for decades, was gone. Not as concrete, that would take time, but as a barrier, a command, a sentence. It had dissolved. And with it, something inside her had softened. She wandered without a plan. The usual rules of time no longer seemed important. Trams came and went, bicycles rolled past. People nodded to one another, quiet acknowledgments of a shared experience none of them could yet name. At a small square, a crowd had gathered. No protest, no slogans, just people standing together. Some held flowers, others held their children. A few sat on benches with their eyes closed, as if listening for something they hadn't heard in years. Anna stood with them for a while. No one spoke, but there was a vibration in the stillness. Not loud, but full. A pulse. In a nearby tree, a bird sang. Not the first bird to sing in Berlin, but perhaps the first one people paused to hear. Later, she returned home. The kettle hissed again. The familiar scent of chamomile filled the room. She opened the window. Not fully, just enough. Outside, she heard laughter. Unscripted. Real. And in that moment, she realized what had changed. Not the city, not the buildings, not the streets, but the silence. For the first time, it did not feel like a weight. It felt like space. Space for something new.
A world reimagined. The next day brought light that seemed a little different, brighter, perhaps, but not in its strength, in its texture. Like light seen after a long illness, as if the eyes were still adjusting. Anna stepped outside with no destination. She carried only her coat, her hands in her pockets, and the quiet anticipation of a city still catching its breath. She walked toward the wall, not out of duty, not from habit, but from a pull, a thread of curiosity woven gently into her steps. The crowd at the checkpoint was thinner now, no longer a wave of astonishment, but a quiet stream of movement. She joined it, crossing again, this time in daylight. The border was still marked by soldiers, though their faces were softer, as if a long command had lifted from their shoulders. On the western side, everything felt more saturated. Colors stood out. Not brighter, but fuller. Deeper reds in shop signs, yellows in window displays, greens in potted plants along cafes. Music spilled from a storefront. Nothing special, just a pop song floating lazily into the air, but it felt like something sacred. Children ran along the sidewalks with helium balloons. People held coffee cups, paper bags, cameras. Some stared across the border, still unsure if they were truly allowed to be there. Anna kept walking. A bookstore appeared. Inside, rows of glossy covers, novels she'd never seen, names she'd only heard whispered. She didn't go in. She just stood at the window, watching pages flutter beneath an overhead fan. Next, a fruit stand. Bananas, oranges, kiwi, a fruit she had never tasted, never even touched. Someone handed her one. An elderly woman, smiling as if they'd known each other for years. Anna held it gently, the skin soft beneath her fingers, its shape unfamiliar. She didn't eat it. She carried it like a token. a reminder that something could exist without warning and still be real. Further on, she passed a music shop. Cassette tapes lined the shelves in neat rows. Some of the bands she recognized by rumor, others by album covers alone. She paused. A small speaker outside the store played a quiet ballad. The melody was slow, almost mournful, but something in it held peace. She leaned against the wall and listened, eyes closed, breathing in the sound. For a moment, time folded. She wasn't a woman from the East or the West, just someone standing between memory and possibility. She stayed in West Berlin for hours, not exploring, not conquering, just observing, letting the unfamiliar become known without rush. When she turned back toward the east, the air felt cooler. The sun had shifted. The wall behind her now seemed less like a wound, more like a scar. Still visible, still tender, but no longer bleeding. Back at her apartment, she placed the kiwi on the table. She would try it later. For now, she opened the window again, watched as lights flickered across the rooftops. The city had not become something new overnight, but it had loosened its grip. And Anna, for the first time in her life, felt ungripped. Not entirely, not yet, but enough to rest without resistance.
The stories we carry. Days passed, not rushed, not defined, just passed. Each morning brought the same light, but it fell differently now. It touched the floorboards like a hand that no longer trembled. Anna noticed it first in the way people spoke. Not louder, just longer. Their words held weight now, not from fear, but from years of being unsaid. At the hospital, conversations began to stretch beyond weather, beyond schedules. A nurse shared how her brother had tried to leave, years ago. No one had ever asked. Now she told it softly, as if placing a stone down after carrying it too far. Another patient spoke of a sister in the West, a letter never answered, a silence mistaken for forgetting. They had never stopped hoping. Anna listened more than she spoke. She always had. But now what she heard was different. At the bakery, the woman behind the counter told her she had hidden a radio in a tin bread box for 7 years. She laughed as she said it, then cried, and no one asked her to stop. Even Anna's neighbor, Frau Richter, a quiet widow who rarely left her flat, appeared at her door one morning with a photograph in hand. In the faded picture, 2 young women stood in front of a train station, smiling. One of them was her sister, she said. They had been separated since 1961. She didn't even know if she was still alive. Anna took the photo in her hand. The paper was thin, edges curled, from years of being touched. That night, Anna sat at her window again. She could hear the city breathing. Not fast, not restless, just steady. A rhythm rediscovered. Below, in the courtyard, a group of children played with a ball. Their laughter bounced off the walls and returned brighter than before. Something had shifted in the way people moved. They no longer clutched their coats so tightly. They no longer checked over their shoulders as often. The city wasn't loud. Berlin had never been loud. But the quiet was warmer now. Not a silence of fear, a silence of space. Space to remember, to speak, to breathe. Anna began writing at night. Not letters, not journals, just lines. Words that had waited inside her. They didn't need to be shared. It was enough that they existed now. One evening, she passed the wall again. People had begun painting on it. Bright shapes. Strange symbols. Sometimes just names. No one stopped them. She stood before a patch of blue. Someone had written, "Wir waren hier." We were here. Simple. Unmoving. True. She touched the paint lightly. Still damp. A child beside her asked her name. She told him. He wrote it beneath the sentence. Small, careful letters. She didn't protest. She didn't move. It wasn't about ego. It was about existing. For years, she had lived quietly. Not invisibly, but softly. And now, for the first time, her quietness felt like a strength. Not a hiding place, but a bridge between what was and what might be.
The days grew shorter. November darkened the corners of the city a little earlier each evening. The air was colder now, but less heavy. There was no longer a rush in the streets. The frenzy of the first days had softened. The voices had quieted. People still crossed the border, but they did so with slower feet, with thoughts rather than adrenaline. The city, like a tide gone out, stood still for a while. Anna walked more often now, not to go anywhere, but to feel what had changed, to step gently through a world that was still unfolding its new skin. She noticed how quickly some things had vanished. Border booths left empty, checkpoints dismantled, quietly and without ceremony. New posters covered old ones, fresh headlines, open invitations, but no one had yet learned how to respond. Change had come, but life always takes longer. She returned to work. The hospital corridors were unchanged, but the way people filled them was not. Patients smiled more. Doctors argued more freely. A janitor played the radio without lowering the volume when someone walked by. One afternoon, in a quiet moment between shifts, Anna stood by the window in the nurse's lounge. From that height, she could see across rooftops, all the way to where the wall still stood. Not yet removed, but already emptied of power. There had been a time when she believed nothing could move that wall. Not tools, not words, not time. But here it was, not gone, but no longer a boundary. And she thought, it was never just concrete. It was never just a structure. The wall had always been made, too, of silence. And now, the silence had changed. At home, she began rearranging her apartment, not out of necessity, out of instinct. She moved a chair to face the window. She gave away old clothes. She opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside, a photograph of her parents, standing on a train platform, holding hands. They had crossed the border once, long before it closed. She placed the photo on the table, not to study it, just to let it be seen.
Outside, the city kept shifting. Children learned new words. Elders remembered old ones. Television channels changed. Menus changed. Postcards were sent and received with no fear of inspection. And yet, in many ways, everything remained the same. Bread was still baked in the mornings. The trams still rattled at 6:12 a.m. Cats still lounged in windows. Snow would soon fall. That was the quiet truth of it. Even when history turns, life continues at its own careful pace. One evening, Anna visited the wall again. Pieces of it were already being chipped away. Some people took fragments with them. Souvenirs. Evidence. Anna didn't take any. She stood where she had always stood, hands in her coat, eyes open. She thought about all the years, the waiting, the watching, the wondering. She thought about how no one had told her this would happen. Not her teachers, not the newspapers, not her own intuition. And yet here it was. Not a dream, not a promise, just a new fact. The wall was open, and she was still herself. But somehow, more. Not because something had been given, but because something had been released. And now, whatever life would become, it would be hers.
The snow came in early in December. Not sudden, just one morning. Soft flakes had already gathered on the windowsill. Thin white layers covering rooftops like whispers. Anna watched it from her kitchen window, tea in hand, steam curling toward the glass. There had been winters like this before, but this one breathed differently. The silence outside was not heavy. It was gentle, wrapped in wool, waiting for no one. She wrapped a scarf around her neck and stepped outside. The air was still. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath, branches motionless beneath the sky. The wall remained, though parts were missing now, removed by machines, by hands, by time. She didn't visit it every day anymore. She didn't need to. The wall was no longer a destination. It was a place memory could rest, like footprints in thawing snow. Life had settled again, but in a different shape. Not smaller, not louder, just freer. Neighbors lingered longer when they greeted each other. Children asked questions no one feared to answer. Even the old songs, once banned, could now be hummed aloud without glances. Anna began to sleep more deeply, not because the world was perfect, but because the tension that lived behind her eyes had loosened. She woke without dread. She walked without calculation. There was still work, still lines at the markets, still long nights and aching backs and moments of doubt. But also, there was choice. A small, steady kind of choice. What street to walk down, what music to play, what word to say next without rehearsing it first. One morning, she visited a gallery that had just opened on the western side. She went alone. No one stopped her. No one asked why. Inside, the walls were white, the space quiet. Paintings lined the rooms, some abstract, some photographs from the weeks after the border fell. She stopped before an image. Two hands, one wrinkled, one young, pressing together through a hole in the wall. No faces, just the contact. She stood there a long time. When she left, the sun was already low in the sky. It lit the snow in warm colors: peach, amber, pale gold. Back at her apartment, she lit a candle. She placed it near the window, not for others to see, just for the stillness. She thought of all the voices she'd never heard, of all the stories held in silence for years, and of how, without shouting, the people had carried on. They had cooked, worked, waited, listened, held hands behind closed doors, and then, one day, the silence ended, and they kept walking. Anna smiled, not outwardly, but inwardly, a soft, slow smile inside her chest. Freedom, she realized, did not have to arrive with flags and declarations. Sometimes it arrived like snowfall, like breath, like waking in a room you've always lived in and finding the window has finally opened.